The gunshot that shattered the evening silence missed Zachary Norwood by mere inches, embedding itself in the oak tree behind her. And she knew without looking back that her husband's brother had finally made good on his threat to silence her forever. She ran through the scrub brush of the Oklahoma Territory, her skirts tangled around her legs, her lungs burning with each desperate breath. The year was 1883, and women who spoke the truth about powerful men rarely lived to see another sunrise. Zachary had committed the unforgivable sin of witnessing something she should not have seen, and worse still, she had refused to pretend otherwise when confronted. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead only 3 weeks when his brother Clayton had come to her small house on the outskirts of Ardmore with blood on his hands and lies on his lips. She had seen him shoot that rancher in cold blood over a property dispute, and when the marshal asked questions, Zachary could not bring herself to lie for a murderer, even one who bore her late husband's name. The shame Clayton had promised to bring upon her was already spreading through town like wildfire. He had told anyone who would listen that she was a woman of loose morals, that she had made advances toward him in her grief, that her testimony was nothing more than the desperate attention-seeking of a widow who had lost her mind. In a town where a woman's reputation was everything, Zachary found herself suddenly alone, doors closing in her face, former friends crossing the street to avoid her gaze. And now Clayton wanted to ensure she would never speak again. Her foot caught on a root and she stumbled, falling hard to the ground. She could hear horses behind her, at least 2 riders, maybe more. Scrambling to her feet, she pushed forward into the growing darkness. The sun had set perhaps 20 minutes earlier, and the Oklahoma landscape stretched out before her in shades of purple and black. She had no destination in mind, only the primal need to survive. Ahead, a small light flickered in the distance. A homestead, perhaps, or a line shack. She had wandered far from town in her panic, nearly 4 miles by her estimation, into territory she did not know well. The light might represent salvation or merely a different form of danger, but she had no other options. Behind her, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Zachary pushed herself harder, her chest aching, her throat raw. The light grew closer, resolving itself into the warm glow of a cabin window. It was a modest structure, well built but small, with a corral beside it holding several horses. Smoke drifted from the chimney, carrying the scent of burning mesquite wood. She stumbled into the yard just as another gunshot cracked through the air, this one closer than before. She pounded on the door with both fists. "Please, help me, please." The door opened so suddenly, she nearly fell forward. A man stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell nearly to his collar and eyes that were difficult to read in the lamplight. He wore simple clothes, a cotton shirt and worn trousers, and held a rifle in one hand with the casual confidence of someone who knew how to use it. "There are men with guns," she gasped. "They are trying to kill me, please." The man looked past her into the darkness, and his expression hardened. Without a word, he pulled her inside and pushed her toward the back of the cabin. "Stay away from the windows." She pressed herself against the wall, watching as he moved to the window and peered out into the night. His movements were economical and calm, without any hint of panic. After a moment, he called out through the partially open window, his voice carrying clearly into the darkness. "This is private property. State your business or move on." There was a pause, then a voice Zachary recognized as Clayton's brother-in-law, Frank Morrison. "We are looking for a woman." "Dangerous criminal. She might have come this way." "There is no one here but me," the man replied, "and I suggest you turn around and head back to wherever you came from. I do not take kindly to armed men riding onto my land after dark. Now listen here, Frank started, but the man cut him off. "No, you listen. I know who you are, Frank Morrison, and I know Clayton Norwood sent you. Whatever business you have, it does not extend to my property. You have 10 seconds to turn those horses around before I start shooting, and I do not miss." Zachary held her breath. Through the window, she could see the dark shapes of 2 riders, their horses shifting nervously. The silence stretched out, heavy with threat and possibility. Then, finally, she heard the creak of saddle leather and the sound of horses being turned. "This is not over," Frank called back. "That woman is wanted for questioning. Then the marshal can come ask his questions in the light of day, proper and legal. Now get off my land." The hoofbeats receded slowly, and the man stayed at the window for several minutes more before he finally lowered his rifle and turned to face her. In the better light, Zachary could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 30 years old, with strong features and a jaw shadowed with several days of beard growth. His eyes were a startling blue-gray, like storm clouds over the prairie, and there was a sadness in them that seemed to match the careful way he held himself, as if he had grown accustomed to solitude. "Thank you," Zachary said, her voice shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "You saved my life." The man studied her for a long moment, then set his rifle aside and gestured to a chair near the fireplace. "Sit down before you fall down. You look about ready to collapse." She did as he suggested, sinking gratefully into the simple wooden chair. Her legs were trembling, and now that she had stopped moving, she could feel a dozen small injuries from her flight through the brush. Her dress was torn in several places, and her hands were scraped raw. The man moved to a basin and wetted a cloth, then brought it to her along with a cup of water. "Drink this slowly. Then you can tell me what this is about." Zachary took the water gratefully, sipping it as instructed while he waited with patient silence. When she finally lowered the cup, she met his eyes and found herself speaking more freely than she had expected. "My name is Zachary Norwood. I was married to Thomas Norwood until he died of fever 3 weeks ago. His brother Clayton shot a rancher named Samuel Henderson over a property dispute 2 days later. I saw it happen, and when the marshal asked questions, I told the truth. Clayton has been spreading lies about me ever since, trying to destroy my reputation so that no one will believe my testimony. Tonight he decided that was not enough. He tried to kill me himself, and when I ran, he sent Frank Morrison and others after me." The man listened without interruption, his expression unchanging. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "I heard about Samuel Henderson. Good man. Did not deserve what happened to him." He paused, then added, "My name is Matthew Carson. I run cattle on this land, about 200 acres worth. I keep to myself mostly, do not go into town much." "I have put you in danger," Zachary said. "Clayton will not forget this. He has influence in Ardmore, friends who will back whatever story he tells." "I have been in danger before," Matthew said quietly. "And I am not afraid of Clayton Norwood or his friends." He moved to the stove and ladled something from a pot into a bowl. "You need to eat. Then we can figure out what happens next." The stew he handed her was simple but good, rich with beef and vegetables. Zachary had not realized how hungry she was until the first bite touched her lips. She ate quickly, trying to maintain some dignity but too desperate to care much about manners. Matthew ate his own meal in silence, sitting across from her with that same air of solitary calm. When they had finished, he collected the bowls and set them aside. "You can sleep in my room tonight. I will take the floor out here by the fire. In the morning, we will ride into town and speak to Marshal Garrett. Whatever Clayton has been saying, the law is the law, and murder is still murder." "The marshal may not listen," Zachary said. "Clayton has been very convincing about my supposed moral failings. There are people in town who believe I am trying to trap Clayton into marriage, that I am making accusations because he rejected my advances." Something flickered in Matthew's eyes, anger perhaps, but his voice remained level. "Then we will make sure he listens. I have lived in this territory for 6 years. I may not socialize much, but I have a reputation for honesty. My word carries weight. Why are you helping me?" The question escaped before Zachary could stop it. "You do not know me. You have nothing to gain and everything to lose." Matthew was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and distant. "5 years ago, I had a wife. Her name was Margaret. She got sick one winter, and by the time I could get her to a doctor in the city, it was too late. I held her while she died, and then I brought her body back here and buried her on the hill behind the cabin." He paused, and Zachary could see the old pain etched in the lines of his face. "Before she passed, she made me promise that I would not let grief turn me cold. She said the world has enough hard men in it, and she wanted me to stay kind. So that is what I have tried to do, even though it would have been easier to just shut everyone and everything out." Tears stung Zachary's eyes. "I am sorry for your loss, and I am sorry for yours," Matthew replied. "Thomas Norwood was a decent man from what I heard. You deserved better than to lose him so young and then be treated the way Clayton has treated you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Matthew stood and showed her to the bedroom, a small space with a simple bed covered in clean quilts. It was clearly the room of a man who valued function over form, but there was a neatness to it that spoke of self-respect and discipline. "I will be just outside if you need anything," Matthew said. "The door has a latch if that makes you feel safer." "I trust you," Zachary said, and realized as she spoke that it was true. There was something fundamentally decent about Matthew Carson, a core of integrity that no amount of loneliness could erode. He nodded and closed the door behind him, leaving her alone in the quiet room. Zachary sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Every muscle ached, and her mind felt foggy with fatigue and stress. She removed her torn dress and laid down in her chemise, pulling the quilts up to her chin. The bed smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke, clean and masculine. Within minutes, despite everything, she fell into a deep sleep. She woke once in the night, disoriented and frightened, but the sound of Matthew moving quietly in the other room reminded her where she was. She listened to him banking the fire, the soft footsteps as he settled down for the night, and felt safer than she had in weeks. Eventually, she drifted back to sleep. Morning came with pale light filtering through the single window. Zachary rose and dressed in her damaged clothing, grimacing at the state of the fabric. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Matthew already awake, making coffee over the stove. He glanced at her and frowned slightly. "That dress will not do for riding into town. Wait here." He disappeared into the bedroom and emerged with a bundle of clothing. "These were Margaret's. She was about your size, maybe a bit taller. You should have something decent to wear when we face down Clayton and his lies." Zachary took the clothes with trembling hands. The gesture felt significant, a sharing of something precious and private. "Are you certain?" "She would want them to be useful," Matthew said. "She was practical that way." The dress was simple but well made, a dark blue cotton with small buttons up the front. It fit reasonably well, though it was indeed slightly long. Zachary rolled the hem and fastened it temporarily, making a mental note to alter it properly later if she had the chance. There were also proper boots, much sturdier than the light shoes she had been wearing. They ate a quick breakfast of bread and coffee, then Matthew saddled 2 horses. His own was a large bay gelding named Duke, calm and steady. For Zachary, he brought out a smaller mare with gentle eyes. Her name is Rosie. She is not fast, but she is reliable. Just let her follow Duke, and she will do fine. The ride into Ardmore took the better part of an hour. As they traveled, Matthew pointed out landmarks and talked about the land in a way that revealed his deep connection to it. He spoke about water sources and grazing patterns, about the challenges of running cattle alone, about his hopes to expand the herd over the next few years. Zachary found herself relaxing despite the anxiety about what awaited them in town. There was something soothing about Matthew's steady presence and his obvious love for this harsh but beautiful territory. As they approached Ardmore, Zachary felt her stomach tighten with dread. The town was small but bustling, with a main street lined with businesses and several side streets of homes. People were already out and about, conducting their morning business. She saw heads turn as they rode past, saw the way conversations stopped and whispers started. The shame Clayton had promised to bring upon her was already in full effect. Matthew seemed to notice her discomfort. "Hold your head up. You have done nothing wrong." They tied their horses in front of the marshal's office, a small building near the center of town. As Zachary dismounted, she saw Clayton himself emerge from the general store across the street. His face darkened when he saw her, and he immediately started walking toward them. Matthew stepped between Zachary and Clayton, his posture relaxed but ready. "Morning, Clayton." "Get out of the way, Carson. That woman is a liar and worse. She needs to answer for her slander." "She needs to speak to the marshal, which is exactly what we are here to do," Matthew replied calmly. "You want to press charges, you can do it proper and legal." Clayton's face flushed red. "You do not know what you are getting into. That woman threw herself at me like a common saloon girl, and when I turned her down, she started making up lies to try to force my hand. Now she has you fooled too." "I do not believe that for a second," Matthew said. "And I think you know that your story does not hold water. A grieving widow who just lost her husband, suddenly developing an obsession with his brother. That is convenient timing for you, especially since her testimony puts a noose around your neck." A crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Zachary could see faces she recognized, women who had once been her friends, men who had done business with Thomas. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to judgment, and she felt the weight of their stares like physical blows. The marshal's office door opened and Marshal James Garrett stepped out, a stocky man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes. "What is all this commotion?" "Marshal, I want this woman arrested for slander and defamation," Clayton said immediately. "She has been spreading vicious lies about me, destroying my good name. And I want to make a statement about what I witnessed," Zachary said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I saw Clayton Norwood shoot Samuel Henderson in cold blood. I told you the truth when you asked, and I stand by every word." Marshal Garrett looked between them, his expression unreadable. "This is a serious situation. Clayton, you have made your accusations known. Mrs. Norwood, you have made your testimony. The problem is, we have two conflicting stories and no other witnesses to what happened with Samuel Henderson." "Then investigate properly," Matthew said. "Look at the evidence. Talk to people." Samuel Henderson was shot over a property dispute, which means there was likely paperwork, correspondence, something that establishes a motive. And as for Mrs. Norwood's character, I can vouch for her." "You," Clayton laughed. "The hermit who lives alone and never comes to town. What do you know about her character? She showed up on your doorstep last night, did she not? Probably spun you some sob story about being persecuted. She is good at that, playing the victim." "She showed up on my doorstep being chased by armed men," Matthew said, his voice hardening. "Frank Morrison and at least one other rider, shooting at her in the dark. That is not lawful behavior, and you know it, Marshal. Whether or not Mrs. Norwood's testimony about the Henderson shooting is accurate, she has a right not to be hunted down like an animal. Marshal Garrett frowned. Frank Morrison was shooting at you, Mrs. Norwood. Yes, sir. Clayton came to my house earlier in the evening and threatened me. When I ran, he sent Frank and others after me. They fired at least 3 shots, one of which came very close to hitting me. That is a lie, Clayton sputtered. I did no such thing. I was at the saloon all evening. Ask anyone. I will ask, the marshal said, but first I want statements from all parties involved. Mrs. Norwood, Mr. Carson, come inside. Clayton, you wait here. They followed the marshal into his office, a cramped space dominated by a large desk and several chairs. Marshal Garrett gestured for them to sit, then took his own seat and pulled out paper and pen. Start from the beginning, Mrs. Norwood. Tell me everything that happened, from the day Samuel Henderson was shot to last night. Take your time and be detailed. Zachary took a breath and began to speak. She described how she had gone to town to purchase supplies 2 days after Thomas's funeral, how she had taken a shortcut through the alley behind the land office, how she had heard raised voices, and then seen Clayton and Samuel Henderson arguing in the small yard behind the building. Samuel had been holding papers, shouting something about fraudulent claims and legal action. Clayton had pulled his gun and shot Samuel twice, once in the chest and once in the head after he had fallen. Then Clayton had seen Zachary watching from the alley entrance. She described how Clayton had approached her, his gun still smoking, and told her that if she knew what was good for her, she would forget what she had seen. How he had mentioned that a widow alone was vulnerable, that accidents could happen, that reputations could be destroyed with just a few well-placed words. She had been terrified but also angry, and when Marshal Garrett had come to her door the next day asking if she had seen anything unusual, she had told him the truth. Matthew listened without interrupting, his face growing darker as she spoke. When she got to the part about Clayton's threats and the lies he had spread, he shifted in his chair, his hands clenching into fists. After that, everything changed, Zachary continued. People I had known for years stopped speaking to me. I received hateful letters. Someone threw garbage at my door. Mrs. Henderson, Samuel's widow, came to see me and said she believed me, but even she was afraid to say so publicly because Clayton's family has influence and money. Last night, Clayton came to my house again. He said he had given me a chance to keep quiet and I had thrown it away. He pulled his gun and I ran. I heard a shot behind me as I went out the back door, and then I just kept running until I saw Mr. Carson's cabin. Marshal Garrett wrote steadily, his pen scratching across the paper. When she finished, he looked up at Matthew. And you, Mr. Carson, what exactly did you see and hear last night? Matthew described the events clearly and concisely. The pounding on his door, Zachary's state of terror, the approaching riders, his confrontation with Frank Morrison. Frank specifically mentioned Clayton's name, Matthew said. He said Clayton Norwood had sent them, and he called Mrs. Norwood a dangerous criminal, which is a stretch by any measure. What exactly is she dangerous for? Telling the truth. The marshal sat back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. These are serious allegations on both sides. Mrs. Norwood, you are claiming that Clayton Norwood committed murder. Clayton is claiming that you are a liar seeking attention or revenge. The problem I have is that there were no other witnesses to the Henderson shooting, and it is your word against his. What about the property dispute? Matthew asked. Samuel Henderson was not the kind of man to make accusations lightly. If he had papers, if he was threatening legal action, there must be documentation somewhere. I have been looking into that, Marshal Garrett admitted. The land office has records of a dispute over water rights between Henderson's ranch and a property that Clayton recently acquired. Samuel claimed that Clayton had falsified some boundary markers to redirect a creek that had traditionally flowed through Henderson land. He was in the process of filing a formal complaint when he died. So there is motive, Matthew said. There is a disagreement over property, which is common enough, the marshal countered. That does not prove murder, and Clayton has 3 men who will swear he was nowhere near that alley when Samuel was shot. 3 men who work for Clayton's family, Zachary said bitterly. Men whose livelihoods depend on staying in his good graces. Marshal Garrett sighed. I am not saying I do not believe you, Mrs. Norwood. I am saying that proving this case will be difficult. A good lawyer could tear apart the testimony of a grieving widow, especially with Clayton's friends casting doubt on your character. So he gets away with murder. Matthew's voice was low and dangerous, because he has money and friends and is willing to destroy an innocent woman's reputation. I did not say that. The marshal stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street. What I am saying is that we need more evidence, something concrete, and in the meantime, Mrs. Norwood, you need a safe place to stay. Going back to your house is not an option, not with Clayton making threats. She can stay with me, Matthew said immediately. My cabin is far enough from town that Clayton cannot harass her easily, and I can make sure she is protected. Zachary felt a surge of gratitude mixed with concern. I cannot ask you to do that. You have already done so much. You are not asking. I am offering. Matthew met her eyes and she saw determination there along with something else, something warmer. Besides, I could use help around the place. Running a ranch alone is hard work. If you are willing to earn your keep, we can call it a business arrangement. The marshal nodded slowly. That might be the best solution, at least temporarily. It keeps Mrs. Norwood safe while I continue investigating. And Mr. Carson, having you involved lends weight to Mrs. Norwood's claims. You are known as an honest man, even if you are a bit of a hermit. Then it is settled, Matthew said, standing. Mrs. Norwood will stay at my ranch until this matter is resolved. And Marshal, I suggest you talk to Frank Morrison about discharging firearms in pursuit of someone who has not been charged with any crime. That kind of vigilante behavior should not be tolerated. I will talk to Frank, the marshal promised, and I will talk to Clayton again as well. This is not over. They left the office to find a larger crowd gathered outside. Clayton was holding court near the general store, surrounded by several men who appeared to be hanging on his every word. When he saw Zachary and Matthew emerge, his expression turned triumphant. Are you going to arrest her, Marshal? Or are you going to let this murderous woman continue spreading her poison? Nobody is being arrested today, Marshal Garrett said loudly, addressing the crowd. But I am continuing my investigation into Samuel Henderson's death, and I expect everyone involved to cooperate fully. That includes you, Clayton. And Frank Morrison, where are you? A lean man with a pockmarked face stepped forward reluctantly. Right here, Marshal. I need to talk to you about last night. Come to my office. Frank glanced at Clayton, who gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. I do not know what you are talking about, Marshal. I was home all evening. That is interesting, because I have a witness who says you were chasing Mrs. Norwood and firing a weapon in the dark. That is a serious crime. Your witness is mistaken, Frank said stubbornly. Must have been someone else. Matthew stepped forward. I saw you clearly, Morrison. I called you by name and you responded. You are not a good enough liar to convince anyone who was actually there. The crowd was murmuring now, people exchanging glances and whispered comments. Zachary could see that at least some of them were beginning to question Clayton's version of events. The fact that Matthew Carson, known for his honesty and integrity, was publicly supporting her carried significant weight. "This is ridiculous," Clayton said, his voice rising. "You are taking the word of a disgraced widow and a man who barely knows her over the word of respected members of this community." "I am taking the word of witnesses and following the evidence," Marshal Garrett said firmly. "Now everyone go about your business. This is not a spectacle." The crowd began to disperse slowly, still talking among themselves. Clayton shot Zachary a look of pure hatred before turning and stalking away, Frank Morrison trailing behind him. Zachary felt her knees go weak with relief and fear mixed together. She had taken a stand, but the battle was far from over. Matthew touched her elbow gently. "Let us get you back to the ranch. You have had enough stress for one day." They retrieved their horses and rode out of town, the morning sun climbing higher in the sky. Zachary was quiet for most of the journey, processing everything that had happened. Matthew seemed to sense her need for silence and did not push for conversation, but his presence was reassuring, solid, and dependable. When they reached the cabin, Matthew helped her dismount and tended to the horses while Zachary went inside. The space felt welcoming after the hostility of town, and she found herself relaxing slightly. She was still wearing Margaret's dress, and she ran her hands down the fabric, thinking about the woman who had owned it. What had Margaret been like? What kind of love had she and Matthew shared? Matthew came inside and immediately went to work preparing a meal. "You should rest. I know that took a lot out of you. I would rather help, if you do not mind. Sitting still will just make me think too much." He nodded and showed her where things were kept. They worked together in comfortable silence, preparing a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and preserved vegetables. As they ate, Matthew asked, "What was your life like before all this?" "Before Thomas died," Zachary thought about it. "Quiet mostly. Thomas worked as a carpenter and did good business. We had a small house, nothing fancy, but it was ours. We had been married for 2 years and were talking about starting a family. I helped him with his accounts and sometimes took in sewing to earn a bit extra. We were not wealthy, but we were happy." She paused, feeling the weight of loss. "Thomas was a good man, patient and kind. His brother is nothing like him. I never understood how they could be family." "Sometimes people take different paths," Matthew said. "The same upbringing can produce very different results. What about you? What was your life like with Margaret?" Matthew was quiet for a long moment, and Zachary thought he might not answer. Then he began to speak, his voice soft with memory. "We met in Texas, where I was working on a big ranch. She was the daughter of a shopkeeper in the nearest town. I would go in for supplies and we would talk, just small conversations at first, but they grew longer each time. She had this laugh, bright and unexpected, and she made everything seem less heavy somehow. We courted for 6 months before I asked her to marry me, and she said yes immediately. We moved up here to Oklahoma Territory because I wanted my own land, wanted to build something that was truly ours. She supported that dream even though it meant leaving her family behind." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land he had mentioned. "We had 3 good years together. 3 years of building this place, of planning our future, of being happy despite the hard work and the isolation. When she got sick, it happened so fast. One day she was fine, laughing and making plans, and the next she could barely get out of bed. By the time I realized how serious it was and got her to a doctor, the fever had taken too strong a hold. She died in a hospital room in Oklahoma City, far from home, and I have always regretted that. I should have gotten her help sooner." Zachary felt tears on her cheeks. "You could not have known." "That is what people say, but it does not change the guilt." He turned back to face her. "After she died, I threw myself into the work. I expanded the herd, improved the cabin, built that corral you saw. I worked until I was too exhausted to think, and then I would get up the next day and do it again. For 2 years, that was my life. Work and solitude and grief. It was not until recently that I realized I was just existing, not really living. Margaret would have hated that. She sounds like she was a wonderful person. She was, and she would have liked you, I think. She always believed in standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. They talked through the afternoon, sharing stories about their lost spouses, about their lives before tragedy had reshaped them. Zachary found herself opening up in ways she had not expected, telling Matthew about her childhood in Kansas, about her dreams of adventure that had been tempered by the reality of frontier life, about her fears and hopes and regrets. Matthew listened with complete attention, asking questions that showed genuine interest, sharing his own experiences in return. As evening approached, Matthew showed Zachary around the property. The cabin sat in a shallow valley with a creek running along one edge of the land. The cattle grazed on the hillsides, about 40 head total, with plans to increase that number over time. There was a vegetable garden behind the cabin, somewhat overgrown but still producing, and a small barn that housed the horses and stored feed and equipment. "It is not much," Matthew said, "but it is mine. No one can take it away or tell me what to do with it." "It is beautiful," Zachary said honestly. The land had a stark beauty to it, all rolling hills and open sky. She could see why Matthew loved it. That night, they ate dinner together and talked more, the conversation flowing easily. Zachary helped clean up afterward, and they fell into a routine that felt natural despite having known each other for less than 24 hours. When it came time for bed, Matthew once again insisted she take the bedroom while he slept by the fire. "This is your home," Zachary protested. "I should not be displacing you from your own bed. You are a guest, and you have been through a traumatic experience. Take the bed." "I have slept in far worse places than in front of a warm fire." Zachary reluctantly agreed and retired to the small bedroom. As she lay in the darkness, she thought about Matthew's kindness, about the way he had defended her without hesitation, about the gentle strength he showed in everything he did. She had known him for such a short time, but she already felt safer with him than she had felt in months, perhaps years. There was something about his presence that called to something in her, a recognition of shared loss and quiet resilience. The days that followed settled into a pattern. Zachary threw herself into helping around the ranch, determined not to be a burden. She tended the garden, weeding and watering and harvesting vegetables that were ready. She cooked meals that were more elaborate than Matthew's bachelor fare, using herbs and seasonings to make even simple ingredients taste better. She mended his clothes, which had accumulated tears and loose buttons from lack of attention. She helped feed the horses and chickens, learning the routines of the ranch. Matthew, for his part, worked with the cattle during the day, riding out to check on the herd and maintain the fences that kept them from wandering too far. He would return in the late afternoon, often dirty and tired, but he always greeted Zachary with a smile that made something warm bloom in her chest. They would work together on evening chores, then share dinner and conversation that ranged from practical matters to deeper topics about life and meaning and the future. On the 4th day after her arrival, they were working together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree. The work was hot and demanding, and Zachary found herself struggling with the heavy posts. Matthew noticed and came to help her, his hands covering hers on the wood, guiding her movements. The touch sent a jolt through her, unexpected and electric. She looked up and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "You are a hard worker," he said quietly. "I appreciate your help. "You saved my life," she replied. "This is the least I can do." "I think it is more than that. I think you are someone who needs to be useful, who needs to contribute. You cannot just sit back and let life happen to you." "Is that wrong?" "Not at all. It is one of the things I admire about you." The word hung in the air between them. Admire. It was not a declaration of love, but it was significant, a recognition of something growing between them. Zachary felt her heart beat faster. "I admire you too," she said softly. "Your strength, your integrity, the way you live according to your principles even when it is difficult." Matthew's hands tightened slightly on hers, and for a moment she thought he might say something more, might close the distance between them. But then he stepped back, releasing her hands, and the moment passed. "We should finish this fence before dark," he said, his voice slightly rough. They worked in silence for a while, but the atmosphere had changed, charged with an awareness that had not been there before. When they finally finished and headed back to the cabin, walking side by side through the fading light, Zachary felt like something fundamental had shifted between them. A week after Zachary had arrived at the ranch, Marshal Garrett rode out to visit. They saw him coming from a distance, and Matthew met him in the yard while Zachary waited nervously on the porch. "Afternoon, Marshal. What brings you out this way?" "I wanted to update Mrs. Norwood on the investigation, and I had some questions for both of you." They invited him inside and offered him coffee, which he accepted gratefully. Once they were all seated, the marshal pulled out a notebook. "I have been doing a lot of digging into the Samuel Henderson case. I talked to people, examined records, followed up on leads. What I have found is interesting." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. "The property dispute between Henderson and Clayton Norwood was more serious than I initially understood. Samuel had hired a surveyor and had documentation proving that Clayton had moved boundary markers to redirect the creek. That is theft of water rights, which is a serious crime in this territory. Samuel was preparing to not only file a civil lawsuit but also criminal charges. So Clayton had a strong motive to want him dead," Matthew said. "Yes. Additionally, I talked to several people who have had dealings with Clayton over the years. There is a pattern of aggressive behavior, of bending rules, of intimidating people who stand in his way. Nothing that rose to the level of criminal charges, but enough to establish character." "What about the actual shooting?" Zachary asked. "Do you have any new evidence?" "This is where it gets complicated. I found someone who saw Clayton near the land office around the time of the shooting. A boy who was playing in the street saw him go down the alley. The boy did not see the actual shooting, but he can place Clayton at the scene, which contradicts his alibi." Zachary felt hope rise in her chest. "That is something, is it not?" "It is something, but it is not enough for an arrest. The boy is only 9 years old, and a defense lawyer would tear apart his testimony. I need more, something concrete." "What can we do?" Matthew asked. The marshal looked uncomfortable. "That is part of why I am here. Clayton knows I am investigating seriously now. He has been making noise about leaving the territory, going to Texas where he has family. If he runs, we may never get justice for Samuel Henderson. So arrest him before he can leave," Zachary said. "I do not have enough evidence yet for a judge to issue a warrant. But if he runs, that itself would be suspicious, would lend weight to your testimony. The problem is, I am worried about what he might do before he leaves. He sees you as the primary threat to his freedom, Mrs. Norwood. As long as you are alive and willing to testify, he is in danger." Matthew stood abruptly, his face hard. "Are you saying you think he might try to kill her again?" "I am saying it is a possibility we need to take seriously. That is why I wanted to make sure you were both being careful. Keep your rifle handy, Mr. Carson. Watch for any signs of trouble. If you see anyone suspicious around your property, send for me immediately. "I will do more than that," Matthew said grimly. "Anyone who comes onto my land with bad intentions will regret it." The marshal stayed for another hour, going over details and discussing strategy. When he finally left, promising to continue his investigation and to keep them informed, Zachary felt more frightened than she had since the night she had fled to Matthew's cabin. "He is going to try again," she said, voicing the fear that had been building in her chest. "Clayton is not the type to give up or run away. He will try to silence me before he leaves." Matthew came to her and took her hands in his, the gesture now familiar and comforting. "I will not let anything happen to you. I promise you that. You cannot watch me every second of every day. And I refuse to live in constant fear, jumping at every shadow. Then we will be smart about it. We will vary our routines, stay alert, make sure we are never completely vulnerable. And if Clayton or any of his men show up here, they will find a fight they are not prepared for." That night, Matthew did not sleep by the fire. Instead, he positioned himself near the front window with his rifle, keeping watch through the dark hours. Zachary could not sleep either, lying awake in the bedroom and listening to the night sounds, every creak and rustle making her heart race. Somewhere around midnight, she gave up on sleep and went out to the main room. Matthew looked up as she approached, his face shadowed in the dim light from the banked fire. "You should be resting. So should you." She sat down near him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "If you are going to stay up worrying, I might as well join you," he smiled slightly. "I am not worrying, I am being prepared." That is the same thing, just phrased differently. They sat together in the darkness, talking quietly about inconsequential things, then deeper things. Matthew told her about his childhood in Missouri, about a father who drank too much and a mother who held the family together through sheer force of will. He talked about leaving home at 16, about learning to cowboy on the big ranches, about the dream of having his own land that had driven him for years. Zachary shared her own stories, about growing up as the youngest of 5 children, about a father who had taught her to read and write when most girls received no education, about the restlessness she had felt as a young woman, the sense that life should be more than just cooking and cleaning and bearing children. Thomas had understood that about her, had encouraged her to keep learning and growing even within the constraints of their life together. "You think you will ever want to marry again?" Matthew asked suddenly, the question hanging in the quiet air between them. Zachary considered carefully before answering. "I do not know. Thomas has only been gone for a month. It feels too soon to even think about such things. But I am only 23 years old. I do not want to spend the rest of my life alone." She paused, then asked, "What about you?" "I have thought about it," Matthew admitted. "For a long time after Margaret died, the idea of being with anyone else felt like a betrayal. But as the years passed, I realized that being alone was not honoring her memory, it was just punishing myself. She would want me to be happy, to find someone to share my life with." He looked at Zachary, his eyes intense even in the dim light. "But finding the right person is not easy. It would have to be someone strong, someone who could handle this life, someone I could respect as an equal. That is a high standard. Anything less would not be fair to either of us." The conversation trailed off, but the silence between them was charged with things unsaid. Zachary felt drawn to Matthew in ways that both thrilled and frightened her. Was it too soon to feel this way? Was she betraying Thomas's memory by being attracted to another man so shortly after his death? But Thomas had been kind and would have wanted her to be happy, to find love again if the opportunity arose. And Matthew, despite his strength and capability, had a gentleness that called to something deep inside her. Eventually, exhaustion won out over vigilance. Zachary dozed off in her chair, and when she woke in the pale light of dawn, She found herself covered with an additional blanket and Matthew still at his post by the window. His dedication touched her deeply, this willingness to sacrifice his own comfort for her safety. The next few days passed without incident. Matthew continued to keep watch at night, catching sleep in the afternoon while Zachary maintained her own vigilance. The marshal sent word through a neighboring rancher that his investigation was progressing, but slowly. Clayton had not left town yet, but was making preparations to do so, selling off some assets and settling accounts. One afternoon, while Matthew was checking the northern pasture and Zachary was working in the garden, she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Her heart immediately began to race, and she dropped her basket of vegetables and ran for the cabin. Matthew had insisted she keep his spare revolver within reach at all times, and she grabbed it from where it rested just inside the door. But as the rider came into view, she recognized Martha Henderson, Samuel's widow. The woman looked haggard and frightened, her clothes dusty from hard riding. Zachary lowered the gun and hurried out to meet her. "Mrs. Henderson, what is wrong?" Martha dismounted clumsily, nearly falling. "I had to warn you. Clayton is planning something. I overheard Frank Morrison and another man talking in the general store. They were speaking quietly, but I heard them say your name and mention tonight after dark." "What exactly did they say?" "Something about finishing what they started, about making sure there would be no witness left to testify. Please, you have to leave here, go somewhere safe." Zachary helped Martha into the cabin and gave her water. "When did you hear this?" "About 2 hours ago. I saddled my horse and came as fast as I could. I am sorry I did not come sooner, that I have been too afraid to speak up publicly. Samuel was a good man and he deserves justice. You were brave enough to tell the truth when I was not." "You are being brave now," Zachary said. "Thank you for the warning." Matthew rode in shortly after, having seen the unfamiliar horse, and hurried back. When they explained what Martha had heard, his face went hard and determined. "Then we will be ready for them. Mrs. Henderson, you should stay here where it is safe. Zachary, I need you to help me prepare." They spent the next few hours making the ranch into a fortress. Matthew positioned rifles at strategic locations, loaded and ready. He brought the horses into the corral closest to the cabin where they could be reached quickly if needed. He made sure all the lamps were full of oil and placed them where they could provide maximum light without making them easy targets if shooting started. Zachary helped with grim determination, pushing aside her fear to focus on the practical tasks. As evening fell, Martha volunteered to ride to the nearest neighbor, old Pete Wilson, who lived about 3 miles away, and ask him to fetch the marshal. It would take time, but if they could hold out until law enforcement arrived, this could end without anyone dying. After Martha left, Matthew and Zachary prepared for a siege. They ate a quick meal, neither having much appetite, and then took up positions where they could watch all approaches to the cabin. The sun set in a blaze of orange and red, painting the Oklahoma sky in colors that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. As darkness fell, they extinguished all but one lamp inside, keeping it positioned to light the interior while making it difficult to see them clearly from outside. "If things go badly," Matthew said quietly, "I want you to take Duke and ride north. There is a rancher named Tom Sullivan about 8 miles that direction. Tell him what happened and ask him to get word to the marshal." "I am not leaving you," Zachary said firmly. "If I tell you to run, you run. Promise me." "No, we stand together or not at all." Matthew looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. Together then." They waited. An hour passed, then 2. The night was quiet except for the usual sounds of cattle and wind. Zachary was beginning to hope that Martha had been wrong, that Clayton had changed his plans, or that the men had been talking about something else entirely. But then Duke whinnied in the corral, a sharp sound of alarm, and Matthew stiffened. "They are here. Stay low and do not shoot unless I do or unless you are sure of your target." Zachary's heart hammered against her ribs. She gripped the revolver, her palms sweaty despite the cool night air. For several minutes nothing happened. Then a voice called out from the darkness. "Carson, send out the woman and nobody has to get hurt. This is between her and the Norwood family. No need for you to die over someone else's lies." Matthew did not respond, his rifle steady as he scanned the darkness for the source of the voice. "We know you are in there," the voice continued. It was Frank Morrison, Zachary recognized. "We have got 5 men out here, all armed. You cannot fight us all. Be reasonable." 5 men come to kill 1 woman, Matthew called back. "That sounds real reasonable, Frank. Why do you not come into the light so we can discuss it properly?" "That is not how this is going to work. Send her out or we will come in and get her. You are welcome to try, but I promise you, some of you will not be riding away when this is done." There was silence, then the sound of men conferring in low voices. Zachary tried to see into the darkness, but could make out nothing beyond the small circle of light from their single lamp. Her fear was a living thing, writhing in her stomach, but she forced herself to stay calm. Matthew needed her focused, not panicking. The first shot shattered the window near where Matthew was positioned. He ducked away, unharmed, and returned fire in the direction the shot had come from. The muzzle flash from his rifle lit up the interior briefly, and more shots came from outside, at least 3 different directions. They had surrounded the cabin. "Get away from the windows," Matthew shouted, and they both retreated to the center of the room, taking cover behind the heavy table that Matthew flipped on its side. Bullets thudded into the wooden walls, and the remaining glass in the windows shattered. 1 shot hit the lamp, extinguishing it and plunging them into darkness broken only by moonlight. Matthew fired several more times, spacing his shots and aiming at the muzzle flashes from outside. Zachary heard a cry of pain, suggesting at least 1 shot had found its mark. But the attackers kept firing, and she realized they were trying to pin them down, keep them from defending the door. She saw shadows moving outside, getting closer. "Matthew, they are trying to get to the door." He swung his rifle around and fired twice at the shapes. One of them fell, but another made it to the side of the cabin. A moment later, something heavy hit the door, then again. They were trying to break it down. Zachary aimed her revolver at the door and fired as it splintered inward. A man stumbled back with a howl of pain. She had hit him in the shoulder, not a killing shot but enough to put him out of the fight. The sight of blood, of knowing she had shot another human being, made her stomach turn, but she forced down the nausea. This was life or death. Matthew was firing steadily now, making each shot count. "I am running low on ammunition," he said. "The spare box is in the bedroom. Can you get it?" Zachary crawled across the floor, staying low, and made it to the bedroom. She found the ammunition box where Matthew had said it would be and grabbed it, along with the extra revolver she knew he kept under the bed. As she turned to crawl back, a figure appeared in the broken doorway, silhouetted against the night sky. It was Clayton Norwood, and he had his gun drawn. "You just could not keep your mouth shut," he snarled. "You had to ruin everything." He raised his gun, aiming directly at her. Time seemed to slow down. Zachary knew she could not bring her own weapon up in time, could not dodge. She was going to die. But then Matthew was there, throwing himself between her and Clayton. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Matthew grunted in pain and fell against Zachary, and she screamed, trying to hold him up. Clayton aimed again, but Zachary managed to bring her revolver up and fire. Her shot went wide, but it made Clayton duck back out the door. "Matthew, oh God, Matthew, are you all right? I am hit, but I will live." "Shoulder, help me to cover." They made it back behind the overturned table. Zachary could feel warm blood soaking Matthew's shirt, but there was no time to examine the wound properly. Outside, she could hear Clayton shouting at his men, and then the firing intensified. They were making a final push, trying to overwhelm them through sheer volume of fire. Zachary loaded fresh ammunition into both revolvers with shaking hands, then returned fire as best she could. Matthew, despite his injury, was still shooting, his face pale but determined in the moonlight. The cabin was being torn apart around them, wood splintering, furniture shattered. She did not know how much longer they could hold out. Then, suddenly, there were new sounds. More gunfire, but from a different direction. Shouting voices, the thunder of hooves. Marshal Garrett's voice rang out clearly. "Drop your weapons. This is the law." The firing from outside stopped abruptly. Zachary heard running footsteps, men fleeing into the darkness. More shouts, the sounds of a brief scuffle, and then, finally, silence. "Carson, Mrs. Norwood, are you all right in there?" "We are alive," Matthew called back, his voice strained. "But I am wounded. Mrs. Norwood is unhurt." Marshal Garrett and several other men entered the cabin cautiously, guns drawn. When they saw the situation, the marshal immediately called for help. "Get some light in here, and someone with medical training now." It was only then that Zachary started to shake, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her weak and trembling. She held Matthew's hand tightly as men brought lamps and began examining his wound. The bullet had gone through his shoulder, missing anything vital, but he had lost a significant amount of blood and would need proper medical care. "We caught 3 of them, including Frank Morrison," Marshal Garrett said. 2 more ran off into the darkness, and we will track them down at first light. But the important one, Clayton Norwood, he is dead. You shot him, Mrs. Norwood, right through the heart." Zachary stared at him, trying to process the words. She had killed a man. It had been self-defense, absolutely justified, but she had ended a human life. The weight of it crashed down on her, and she felt tears streaming down her face. "You did what you had to do," Matthew said, squeezing her hand. "He was going to kill us both. You saved our lives." The next hours passed in a blur. A doctor was summoned from town and came to treat Matthew's wound, cleaning and bandaging it properly. The marshal took statements from both of them, documenting everything that had happened. Bodies were removed from the property. The cabin was assessed for damage, which was extensive but repairable. Martha Henderson appeared sometime near dawn, having ridden back with Pete Wilson and the marshal. She helped Zachary clean up the blood and debris, working in quiet solidarity. When they finally had a moment alone, Martha hugged her tightly. "You did it. You made sure Samuel gets justice. Clayton is dead and his accomplices will stand trial. It is over." "It does not feel over," Zachary said. "It feels like everything is broken, because you are tired and in shock. Give it time. You will see that this is a new beginning, not an ending." By mid-morning, Matthew was resting in his bed, dosed with laudanum for the pain. The doctor said he would recover fully, but needed rest. Marshal Garrett had left with his prisoners, promising to return in a few days for follow-up questions. Martha had gone home, satisfied that justice would be served. And Zachary was alone with her thoughts, sitting in the damaged cabin and trying to make sense of everything. She had come here seeking shelter and had found so much more. Matthew had taken her in without hesitation, had protected her with his life, had shown her kindness and respect when the rest of the world had turned against her. And somewhere in the chaos and fear, she had fallen in love with him. The realization should have shocked her, coming so soon after Thomas's death, but it felt natural, inevitable. Matthew was nothing like Thomas had been, and perhaps that was part of why she could love him. This was not replacing one man with another. It was opening her heart to someone new. But did he feel the same way? Or had his protection been only duty, the fulfillment of the promise he had made to his late wife to stay kind and help those in need? The thought that he might not return her feelings was painful, but she resolved to tell him anyway. Life was too short and too uncertain to leave important things unsaid. Over the next several days, as Matthew recovered, Zachary cared for him with dedicated attention. She changed his bandages, brought him meals, read to him from the few books he owned, and sat with him for hours, just talking. He was a difficult patient, impatient with his own weakness, wanting to get up and work despite doctors' orders to rest. Zachary had to physically restrain him more than once, scolding him like a child until he reluctantly returned to bed. "You are worse than a stubborn mule," she said on the third day after catching him trying to sneak out to check on the horses. "The doctor said 2 weeks of rest minimum. You have barely managed 3 days. The ranch does not run itself," Matthew grumbled. "There are things that need doing. And I have been doing them. The horses are fed, the cattle are fine, the garden is tended, everything is under control. Now get back in that bed before I tie you to it." Despite his frustration, there was warmth in his eyes as he looked at her. "You have been taking care of everything, and me. I do not know how to thank you. You do not need to thank me. After everything you have done for me, caring for you while you heal is nothing. It is not nothing." He caught her hand, pulling her to sit on the edge of the bed. "Zachary, I need to tell you something." Her heart began to race. "What is it?" "When Clayton pointed that gun at you, when I thought he was going to shoot you, I realized something. I realized that I could not bear to lose you. Not just because it would be wrong, not just because I had promised to protect you, but because somewhere along the way you have become essential to me. I know it has only been a few weeks, and I know you are still grieving Thomas, but I need you to know. I love you. I am in love with you." Zachary felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy this time. "I love you too. I have been trying to figure out how to tell you, worried it was too soon, worried you would think less of me for moving on so quickly. Moving on is not forgetting. You will always carry Thomas in your heart, and that is as it should be. But you are alive, and you deserve to be happy, to be loved. If you will have me, if you think you could be content with this life and this rough cowboy, I would be honored to be the one who loves you." She leaned down and kissed him, gently at first, mindful of his injury, but then with growing passion as he pulled her closer with his good arm. The kiss was everything she had imagined and more, full of promise and desire and the kind of deep connection that could not be faked or forced. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matthew smiled. "I am taking that as a yes." "Yes," Zachary said, laughing through her tears. "Yes to everything." They spent the rest of Matthew's recovery planning their future together. They would marry as soon as he was well enough to travel to town. They would rebuild the damaged parts of the cabin and expand it, making room for the family they both hoped to have. They would work the ranch together, equal partners in all things. And they would do it with joy, honoring the people they had lost by living fully and loving deeply. Marshall Garrett came by a week after the attack with news. Frank Morrison and the other 2 captured men had confessed to their roles in the attempt on Zachary's life, and had also implicated Clayton in Samuel Henderson's murder. With their testimony and the other evidence the marshal had gathered, the case was closed. Samuel would get justice, and Zachary's name was cleared completely. In fact, she was being hailed as a hero, the brave widow who had stood up to corruption and violence. "There is more," the marshal said. "Clayton's property, the land he took from Samuel Henderson through his schemes, is being returned to Martha Henderson. And the Norwood family, what is left of them, has left Oklahoma Territory entirely. They want nothing to do with the scandal. "You are safe, Mrs. Norwood, completely and truly safe." The relief was overwhelming. For the first time since Thomas's death, Zachary felt like she could breathe freely, like the future was full of possibility rather than threat. She thanked the marshal profusely, and he left with wishes for their happiness. 6 weeks after Zachary had first knocked on Matthew's door, fleeing for her life, they were married in a simple ceremony at the church in Ardmore. Martha Henderson stood as witness, along with Pete Wilson and several other neighbors who had come to respect Zachary's courage and Matthew's integrity. The town's opinion had shifted entirely. Where once she had been shunned, now she was welcomed. Where once there had been whispers and judgments, now there were congratulations and support. Zachary wore a simple white dress that Martha had helped her make, and Matthew wore his best suit, his arm still in a sling but his smile radiant. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The reception was held at the ranch, which had been repaired and cleaned until it shone. Neighbors brought food and well wishes, and for the first time since Margaret's death, Matthew's home was filled with laughter and music and celebration. Zachary looked around at the gathered people, at the land that was now hers as well as his, and felt a deep sense of rightness. This was where she belonged. That night, after the guests had departed and they were finally alone, Matthew carried Zachary over the threshold of their home. She laughed at the traditional gesture, but there was something deeply meaningful about it. This was a new beginning for both of them, a conscious choice to move forward together. Their first months of marriage were filled with hard work and deep happiness. They labored side by side to improve the ranch, to build the life they had envisioned together. Zachary proved to be an excellent partner, quick to learn and unafraid of difficult work. Matthew, for his part, blossomed under her care and companionship, his natural warmth returning after years of grief-imposed solitude. When winter came, they stayed close to home, weathering storms wrapped in each other's arms, talking for hours by the fireplace, making love with increasing passion and familiarity. They learned each other's bodies and hearts, building intimacy layer by layer. Zachary found that being with Matthew was entirely different from being with Thomas. Thomas had been gentle and somewhat hesitant, while Matthew was confident and passionate. She loved this new dynamic, the way he made her feel both protected and desired. By spring, Zachary realized she was pregnant. The realization came with a mix of emotions. Joy, certainly, but also a strange pang of guilt, as if having Matthew's child somehow betrayed Thomas's memory. She struggled with these feelings for several days before finally confessing them to Matthew. He listened patiently, then took her hands in his. "Thomas would be happy for you. He loved you and would want you to have a full life, including children. And our child will know about him, about the good man he was. We will make sure of that. But this baby is a celebration of our love, of this new life we are building together. You do not need to feel guilty." His words helped, and as her belly grew, so did her excitement. They prepared the cabin for the baby's arrival, Matthew building a beautiful cradle from oak wood and Zachary sewing tiny clothes and blankets. Neighbors visited often, Martha Henderson especially, bringing advice and supplies and companionship. On a hot afternoon in August of 1884, Zachary gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long and difficult, but Matthew stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and encouraging her. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced, Matthew wept openly at the sight of his son. They named him James Thomas Carson, honoring both of Zachary's husbands. Little James had his father's blue-gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and from the beginning, he was loved fiercely by both parents. Matthew proved to be a devoted father, getting up for night feedings, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours just holding his son and marveling at the miracle of new life. As James grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Matthew and Zachary expanded their herd and improved their land. They built additions onto the cabin, including a proper second bedroom and a larger kitchen. They welcomed more children, a daughter named Margaret Ann in 1886 and twin boys, Samuel and Peter, in 1888. Their home was filled with noise and chaos and love. The years passed quickly, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and family growth. Zachary sometimes thought about how differently her life had turned out from what she had imagined. If Thomas had not died, if Clayton had not murdered Samuel Henderson, if she had not fled to Matthew's door that terrifying night, she would be living a completely different existence. Part of her would always mourn Thomas and the life they might have had together. But she could not regret the path that had led her to Matthew, to this ranch, to these children. Matthew, too, had been transformed by their life together. The lonely, grief-stricken man who had isolated himself for years had become a respected member of the community, a loving husband, and a devoted father. He often told Zachary that she had saved him just as surely as he had saved her, that she had brought him back to life when he had been merely existing. They made a practice of visiting Margaret's grave together several times a year, bringing flowers and standing in quiet remembrance. Zachary always felt that Margaret's spirit was pleased, that she would approve of how Matthew had honored her memory by continuing to live with kindness and love. And when they visited Thomas's grave in the Ardmore Cemetery, Matthew stood respectfully back while Zachary said her private prayers, thanking Thomas for the love he had given her and for the man he had been. Martha Henderson remained a close friend, eventually remarrying a widower from a neighboring ranch and finding happiness again herself. She often remarked that she and Zachary were like sisters, bound together by tragedy but sustained by resilience and hope. The four adults and their combined children spent holidays together, creating new traditions and building a chosen family. As the children grew older, James in particular showed an aptitude for ranching. He loved working with the cattle and horses, loved the land with the same passion his father did. Margaret Ann was bright and bookish, constantly asking questions and demanding to be taught everything her parents knew. The twins were mischievous and inseparable, keeping their parents constantly entertained and occasionally exasperated. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Matthew and Zachary took a rare day away from the children, leaving them in Martha's care, and riding out to a spot on the edge of their property where the land rose up to give a view of miles of rolling prairie. They sat together watching the sunset, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest. "You ever regret it?" Matthew asked quietly. "This life, this place, me?" "Never," Zachary said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me everything that matters: safety, love, respect, partnership. You gave me a home and a family. How could I possibly regret that? I just want to make sure you are happy, that you do not feel like you settled for less than you deserved." She turned to look at him, cupping his face in her hands. "Matthew Carson, you are not less than anything. You are the best man I have ever known. You took me in when I had nothing, when the whole world had turned against me. You protected me with your life. You loved me when I thought I would never be loved again. And you have given me 10 years of happiness that I treasure every single day. I did not settle. I found the person I was meant to be with." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and they made love there on the prairie as the sun set around them, celebrating a decade of partnership and passion. The years continued to pass, bringing the usual mix of joys and sorrows. They lost crops to drought and celebrated excellent harvests. They nursed sick animals back to health and mourned those they could not save. They watched their children grow and change, becoming individuals with their own personalities and dreams. Through it all, Matthew and Zachary faced each challenge together, their love deepening with each shared experience. By the time James was 20 and preparing to take over more of the ranch operations, Matthew and Zachary were in their early 50s. They had weathered hard times and celebrated good ones, had raised 4 children to near adulthood, and had built a legacy that would outlast them. The cabin had been expanded and improved until it was a proper ranch house, comfortable and welcoming. The land had prospered under their stewardship, supporting not only their family but also providing employment for several ranch hands. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out, Matthew took Zachary's hand. "Do you remember the night you showed up at my door? Running for your life, terrified and alone, of course. How could I forget? It was the night that changed everything. I think about it sometimes, about how one moment, one decision can alter the entire course of a life. If I had turned you away, if I had been too cautious or too afraid of Clayton's power, neither of us would have this life we have built. But you did not turn me away. That is who you are. That is the man I fell in love with. And you brought me back to life. You brought joy and purpose and love into a house that had been empty of all those things. You brought me dignity, Zachary. Before you came, I was just going through the motions, existing but not really living. You made me whole again." "We made each other whole," Zachary corrected gently. "That is what love does. It does not complete us as if we were incomplete before, but it makes us better versions of ourselves. You showed me that I could be strong and brave. I showed you that your heart had not died with Margaret, that you were still capable of love and joy. We saved each other." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, 2 people who had found each other in the midst of chaos and built something beautiful and lasting. The past was full of sorrow and loss, but also of courage and resilience. The present was rich with love and family. And the future, whatever it might bring, would be faced together. Years later, when they were old and gray, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Matthew and Zachary would still tell the story of how they met. They would describe the fear and the danger, the bravery and the determination, and the love that had grown from the ashes of tragedy. Their grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, marveling at the adventure and romance of it all. But the real story was not in that dramatic beginning. The real story was in the decades that followed, in the daily choice to love and support each other, to work as partners, to build a life of dignity and joy. The real story was in the thousands of small moments. Morning coffee shared in peaceful silence, hands held across the dinner table, quiet laughter in the dark, tears shed together and comfort given freely, pride in each other's accomplishments, forgiveness for each other's failings. When Matthew finally passed away at the age of 76, surrounded by his family, his last words were to Zachary. "Thank you for everything. Thank you for loving me, for making my life more than I ever dreamed it could be. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." Zachary held his hand and whispered back, "And you saved me in every way a person can be saved. I love you. I will always love you." She lived another 3 years after his death, cared for by her children and surrounded by the ranch they had built together. In those years, she often sat on the porch where they had spent so many evenings together, remembering and feeling grateful. She had lived a full life, had loved deeply twice, had raised children who were good and decent people, had left a mark on the world that mattered. When her time came, she died peacefully in her sleep, and her children buried her next to Matthew on the hill behind the ranch house, not far from where Margaret rested. The family gathered to honor her memory, telling stories about her courage and kindness, about the love she and Matthew had shared, about the legacy of strength and integrity she had left behind. James Carson took over the ranch, running it with the same dedication his parents had shown. He made sure his own children knew the story of how their grandparents had met, how a lonely cowboy had taken in a woman escaping shame, and how together they had built a life of dignity and joy. The story became part of the family lore, passed down through generations, a reminder that even in the darkest times, courage and love could prevail. The ranch itself prospered for decades more, a testament to the foundation Matthew and Zachary had built. And though the original cabin was eventually replaced with a larger, more modern structure, the family always maintained the small cemetery on the hill, where 3 graves stood in silent testimony to lives well lived and love that transcended death. In the end, that was their legacy. Not wealth or fame, but love that had transformed lives, courage that had faced down evil, and a partnership that had created something beautiful and lasting. The lonely cowboy and the woman fleeing shame had found each other in the wild Oklahoma territory of 1883, and together they had built something that would endure long after they were gone. Their story became a legend in the area, told and retold, evolving with each generation but maintaining its essential truth. That kindness and courage matter, that love can heal the deepest wounds, and that 2 broken people can come together to create something whole and beautiful. It was a story of the Wild West, certainly, with all the danger and drama that era entailed. But more than that, it was a story about the human heart, about resilience and redemption, about the power of choosing love over fear. And so the story of Matthew Carson and Zachary Norwood lived on, a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes and the most difficult circumstances, hope and love can flourish. Their graves on that Oklahoma hillside became a place of pilgrimage for their descendants, who would stand there and remember that they came from strength, from courage, from a love that had defied the odds, and created a legacy that would never be forgotten. The land itself seemed to remember them, the wind whispering through the grass that grew over their graves, the creek that Matthew had fought to protect still flowing clear and strong. The ranch continued to thrive, generation after generation, each one adding their own chapter to the story, while honoring the foundation that had been laid by a lonely cowboy and a woman escaping shame, who had found each other and, in doing so, had found themselves.